The silent abyss. The wind howled like the cry of some ancient beast across the desolate plateau. Zara stood on the edge of a towering cliff, gazing into the abyss below. The blue sky above her was empty, save for the streaks of thin clouds that swept by like ghosts. The once vibrant world around her had turned dull and lifeless over the years. Once, this planet had been a haven for her people, a place of beauty, prosperity, and hope. But now, all of it was gone. Zara's heart ached as she remembered the days of peace, when the sun bathed the world in warm light and the air smelled of lush forests. That was before the invasion, before the plague, before everything she had known crumbled into dust. The alien princess, heir to a kingdom that no longer existed, had watched it all fall apart, helpless to stop it. Now she was the last of her kind, standing at the edge of a world she had no place in. She couldn't remember how long she had been wandering this lonely planet, or how many times she had stood on the edge of this cliff, staring into the empty void, debating whether it was time to let go. What was left for her? What could she possibly offer to a world that had forgotten her people? The sadness that gripped her heart was suffocating, and for a moment she considered surrendering to the darkness below. But then something changed. A strange sound broke through the silence. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, the thrum of something mechanical echoing across the barren landscape. Zara frowned, her senses sharpening. She stepped back from the cliff's edge and looked around. Was it possible that she wasn't alone? From the horizon, something appeared, a ship, descending rapidly. Its hull gleamed in the light of the dying sun, a bright, metallic structure that seemed out of place against the desolation. The ship was plummeting toward the surface, struggling against some unseen force, and Zara's eyes widened in disbelief. The ship crashed with a thunderous explosion not far from where she stood. The ground shook beneath her feet as a cloud of smoke and dust rose into the air. Zara's heart raced. Whoever was inside, they might need help. But would she be able to help them? Was there any point in trying to save someone from another world when her own world was already lost? Curiosity tugged at her, though, and despite the hesitation in her heart, Zara began to move toward the wreckage. As she got closer, she could see the twisted remnants of the ship scattered across the rocky terrain. It had been a violent crash, one that would have surely killed anyone inside, she thought. But there, amid the wreckage, she saw movement. A figure emerged from the smoke, covered in soot and dust. Zara's breath caught in her throat as she saw a human, a young man no older than 25 with a dark, scruffy beard and a look of shock and confusion on his face. He was alive. The human stumbled, his legs weak from the crash, but he managed to stand. Zara hesitated for a moment, watching him carefully. His eyes scanned the surroundings, clearly disoriented before locking onto her. He froze as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Zara felt a pang in her chest. She had seen so many people die, so many of her own people, but this human. Something about him stirred a deep, unfamiliar feeling within her. Maybe it was the realization that, despite her isolation, she wasn't completely alone. The human took a step forward, still unsure of his surroundings. Zara's voice, once silenced by grief, found its way to her lips. "Are you all right?" Her words felt foreign, strange on her tongue, but she tried again. "I can help you." The human blinked, clearly shocked by her presence. His voice was rough, his words slurring as though he hadn't spoken in days. "Help who? What are you?" Zara's brow furrowed, she wasn't sure how to answer. "I am Zara, and you are from another world." The human nodded slowly, the confusion still evident in his eyes. "I'm Luca, I was on a mission, and then everything went wrong, my ship crashed." Luca staggered toward her, his steps slow and unsure. Zara's instincts told her to stay distant, to not get involved. But something deeper, something more primal, urged her to take the risk. She stepped closer, offering her hand. "You are safe now," she said quietly. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Zara felt the weight of her isolation begin to lift. There was hope, perhaps not for her people, but for herself. Perhaps this human, Luca, would be the key to finding the answers she had long since given up on. Shattered skies. Luca stumbled as he reached Zara's outstretched hand. His body was weak, the crash having taken a heavier toll on him than he had initially realized. His legs felt like lead, and his head spun with dizziness, but he wasn't sure if it was the physical pain or the sheer surrealism of the moment that made him feel unsteady. He had just been on a routine mission, charting the farthest reaches of space, and now he found himself on an alien world, standing face to face with a creature. No, a person, who was clearly not human. She was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Her pale skin shimmered with an almost ethereal glow, and her eyes, deep and dark as the night sky, seemed to contain the weight of entire galaxies. Her presence was both alien and familiar in some strange way, and the longer he looked at her, the more the sensation of dislocation grew. "You're not human," Luca said finally, his voice hoarse. Zara nodded. "No, I am not." She withdrew her hand but kept a steady, watchful gaze on him. The wind around them was picking up again, and the dust from the crash site was swirling in a chaotic dance across the rocky terrain. Luca felt the harsh dryness of the planet's air on his skin, but it wasn't just the atmosphere that made him uncomfortable. It was Zara herself. There was something about her, something that felt both familiar and painfully distant, as though she belonged to another time, another place. "How are you, still alive?" Luca asked, his voice filled with both awe and confusion. "Your ship crashed so violently." Zara tilted her head slightly, her eyes scanning him curiously. "You ask many questions. I have been alive for longer than you would think." Luca frowned, trying to process the gravity of her words. He was still trying to figure out if he was dreaming or if this was some kind of hallucination brought on by the crash. But no, it was all too real, too tangible. He could feel the dust in his throat, taste the metallic tang of the wreckage on his lips, and Zara. She was standing there in front of him, solid and unyielding. "You must be from far away," Luca murmured. "I've never seen anything like you." Zara's expression softened, but it was brief, like a flash of something buried deep within her. "I am from far away, yes, my people once ruled this world. Now I am the last of them." Luca nodded slowly, unsure of what to say next. The weight of her words hit him, and he felt a sudden pang of sorrow for her. To be the last of a people, he could only imagine what that must be like. But before he could offer any comfort, Zara spoke again. "You should not stay here," she said, her voice low. "This world is dying, it has no future." Luca looked around at the barren landscape, the jagged rocks and darkened skis. It was a haunting place, lifeless and cruel, but something about the way she said it struck him deeply. What happened to it? Zara's gaze darkened, her eyes turning inward as though she were reliving memories that she could not escape. "War, disease, my people. We tried to save ourselves, but we failed. Now this planet is empty, nothing remains." There was a long pause as Luca processed what she had said. He didn't know what to say in response. He was an outsider, a stranger in a land he didn't belong in, and yet he felt a strange connection to this alien girl who had lost everything. But he had his own loss to contend with. His mission, his crew, it was all gone. He was alone, just like her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, almost instinctively. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't cause it," Zara interrupted, her voice sharp but not unkind. "It was not your fault." Luca fell silent, his eyes lowering to the ground. The air was thick with the weight of their unspoken grief, and neither of them seemed to know how to move forward. He was stranded here with no way of getting back to his ship, and she was a princess of a fallen world, the last survivor of a civilization that no longer existed. They were both trapped in their own stories, and neither seemed to know how to end theirs. "You said you could help me," Luca said, breaking the silence. He had no idea how, but something about Zara's calm, steady presence made him feel like he wasn't entirely helpless. "How?" Zara studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words. She didn't answer immediately, but instead turned and began walking toward the wreckage of his ship. Her movement was fluid, almost graceful, like someone accustomed to navigating harsh landscapes. Luca followed her, still feeling the effects of the crash but unwilling to let her out of his sight. "Your ship, it is beyond repair," Zara said softly, her gaze lingering on the twisted remains of the vessel. "But I can help you find another way." Luca's heart sank. "Another way, how?" "I know of a place," Zara said. "A place where we might find something that can help you, but it is not far. You will need to travel with me." Luca's mind raced. The idea of leaving the wreckage, of venturing into a world so foreign to him, was terrifying. He had no idea what dangers lay ahead, what creatures or forces might threaten them, but the alternative was far worse. Staying here alone, surrounded by the ghosts of Zara's fallen world. That wasn't an option. If there was even a slim chance of survival, he had to take it. "All right," Luca said after a long pause. "I'll go with you." Zara turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "Then we will leave at once. The storm will arrive soon." Without another word, she began walking, her pace steady and purposeful. Luca hesitated for only a moment before following her. He had no idea where this journey would take him, or if he would ever make it out alive, but for the first time since the crash, he felt a flicker of hope. As they walked, the silence between them deepened. They shared no common language, no understanding of one another's pasts, and yet there was something unspoken that connected them, a shared knowledge that, in this moment, they were each other's only chance at survival. And perhaps, just perhaps, they could find something more in each other than they had ever expected. Echoes of the past. The wind howled again as Zara and Luca made their way across the barren terrain. The once vibrant planet was now just a desolate wasteland, the jagged rocks and cracked earth serving as grim reminders of what it had once been. Zara moved with a quiet determination, her footsteps sure and measured, while Luca struggled to keep pace, his body still aching from the crash. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, and the air was thick with dust, making every breath feel heavier than the last. They walked in silence for a long time, neither of them speaking, as if the weight of their own thoughts was too much to put into words. The only sound was the soft crunch of their footsteps against the dry earth and the occasional gust of wind that whipped through the landscape, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Luca glanced at Zara occasionally, studying her as they walked. He had learned so little about her since their first meeting. She had spoken briefly about her world, her people, their fall from grace, but there was so much she had yet to reveal. He wondered what she was thinking, what memories were haunting her behind those dark eyes of hers. The way she moved, the way she held herself, it was as if she carried the weight of the entire planet on her shoulders. At last, Luca spoke, breaking the silence. "Where exactly are we going?" Zara didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed ahead. It was as if she was measuring the distance, not just between the two of them, but between the present and the past. "There is a place," she said quietly, "hidden deep within the mountains. It's where my people once gathered, where we kept the knowledge of our world. If there's any chance of finding something to help you, it would be there." Luca frowned. "And you think this place is still intact, after everything that's happened?" Zara's lips curled into a faint, almost sad smile. "I do not know, but it is the only place left where something of value might remain. I can only hope that my people left something behind before." She trailed off, and Luca didn't press her. He understood the pain behind her words. There was no need to say more. They continued walking, and as the hours passed, Luca began to notice the changes in the landscape. The dry, cracked earth was slowly giving way to towering cliffs and jagged rock formations. The wind seemed to die down, and the air grew colder, more oppressive. It felt as though the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Waiting for them. As they neared the base of the mountain, the ground grew steeper and the path narrowed. The jagged rocks beneath their feet were sharp and unforgiving, and Luca had to be careful not to slip. Zara, however, moved with the grace of someone who had walked these paths countless times before, her movements fluid and instinctive. It was as if the mountain itself knew her, as if it had become a part of her. Luca's curiosity got the better of him, and he found himself asking again, "What happened to your people, Zara? You said there was war and disease, but why did they let it happen?" Zara's face hardened, her expression turning distant as the question seemed to strike a deeper chord within her. She paused for a moment, looking out at the vast expanse of the mountains, her eyes distant, as if seeing something far beyond the present moment. "They believed they were invincible," Zara said softly. "My people were powerful, advanced beyond anything you could imagine. We had technology that could reshape the very fabric of the world. But with power came arrogance. We thought we could control everything, control the planet, control time, control life itself." She glanced at Luca, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and bitterness. "And in the end, it was our own arrogance that destroyed us. The war was only the beginning. When the plague came, it spread like wildfire. There was no cure, no way to stop it. It killed millions and the rest of us. We watched as our world fell apart. We tried to fight back, but it was too late. My family, my parents, they couldn't stop it." Luca swallowed hard. He couldn't imagine the kind of loss Zara must have felt, watching her world crumble, knowing that her people's hubris had led to their downfall. He couldn't even begin to fathom what it must have been like to be the last survivor of an entire civilization. "And now," Zara continued, her voice tinged with quiet resolve, "I am the last of them. My people are gone, and their legacy is buried here in the dust of this planet. I am all that remains." They walked in silence for a while longer, the weight of Zara's words hanging heavy between them. Luca wanted to say something, anything, that would ease her pain, but he knew there was nothing he could say. Her grief was too deep, too old, and it was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the base of the mountain. Zara stopped, her eyes scanning the rocky landscape ahead. The mountain loomed before them, a massive, towering structure that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. There was something ancient about it, something that spoke of forgotten times and lost histories. "This is it," Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The entrance is hidden inside the mountain, but we will have to climb." Luca looked up at the sheer cliff face, feeling a wave of dread wash over him. The idea of climbing a mountain of this size seemed impossible, but Zara didn't seem concerned. She was already moving toward a narrow crack in the rock that Luca hadn't even noticed before. She moved with the ease of someone who had done this countless times, her body fluid and sure as she began to scale the rock face. "Wait for me," Luca called, his voice laced with urgency. But Zara didn't wait. She simply continued climbing, her form disappearing into the darkened recesses of the mountain. Luca felt a brief moment of panic surge through him. He wasn't in great shape. His body was still recovering from the crash, and he had no idea if he would be able to keep up. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and began to climb after her. The rocks were sharp, and the climb was grueling. Luca's muscles screamed in protest with every move, but he pushed forward, one hand gripping the stone after the next. As he climbed higher, the air grew thinner, and the world below him seemed to fall away, leaving only the steady rhythm of his breathing and the sound of his hands scraping against the rock. It took hours, but eventually Luca reached the narrow ledge where Zara was waiting. She had found an entrance, an archway carved into the rock, its edges worn smooth by time. "This is it," Zara said, her voice filled with a quiet triumph. Luca looked at the entrance, then back at her, his exhaustion giving way to awe. Whatever lay beyond this door, it was something that had been hidden for eons. It was something that could hold the key to both their futures. He stepped forward into the darkness. Across the void. The dark entrance loomed before them, a jagged hole in the face of the mountain that seemed to swallow the light. Zara stepped forward, her movements precise and purposeful. Her eyes, accustomed to the dark, glimmered faintly as she disappeared into the shadows. Luca hesitated for a moment before following her, his hand brushing the stone wall as he stepped inside. The air within the mountain was cool and thick with dust, the smell of ancient stone mixed with the faint odor of something long forgotten. Inside, the space opened up into a vast, hollowed-out cavern. The walls were etched with strange symbols and markings, some in a language Luca couldn't understand, others so ancient that they seemed almost alien even to Zara. The light from the entrance faded quickly, leaving them in a profound darkness, but Zara's presence provided a sense of direction. Her movements seemed to draw from some deep well of knowledge, as if she had traversed this space countless times before. Luca's eyes adjusted to the gloom, his pulse quickening with the realization that they were standing in the heart of something monumental. He had been in ancient ruins before, on far-flung planets, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer scale of what lay before him. It felt like an ancient temple, a repository of untold knowledge that had stood the test of time, waiting for someone to find it. "We are close," Zara whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. "I can feel it." Luca followed her as she moved deeper into the cavern. The further they went, the more oppressive the air became. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that spoke of years, centuries, or even millennia of abandonment. And yet, despite the stillness, Luca couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that something was watching them from the shadows. They reached a narrow corridor, the walls so close together that Luca had to squeeze through. Zara was already ahead of him, her slender form slipping through the gap with ease. Luca followed, his chest tight as the space constricted around him. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, pushing him into a past that didn't belong to him. Finally, they emerged into a larger chamber, and Luca nearly stumbled as his eyes fell upon what lay within. The chamber was unlike anything he had ever seen. At its center stood a massive structure, a kind of crystalline monument that shimmered with a soft, ethereal light. The walls of the chamber were lined with ancient technology, mechanisms, devices, and screens, many of them shattered or worn down by time. But the monument at the center of the room was undisturbed, its surface smooth and flawless, as though it had been untouched for eons. Zara stopped in front of the monument, her expression one of reverence. For a moment, she didn't speak. She simply stood there, her gaze fixed on the crystalline structure, as if communing with it in some way. This, she said quietly, finally breaking the silence, is the heart of my people's knowledge. It is a repository of everything we once were, our history, our science, our culture, everything. Luca's eyes widened. This is what you've been searching for. Yes, Zara replied. This is the key to everything, the last hope for my people and perhaps for yours. Luca stepped closer, his hands hovering over the surface of the crystal. It felt warm to the touch, as though it were alive. He could sense a kind of energy pulsing from within it, a strange hum that seemed to vibrate in his bones. There was something almost sentient about it, as though the crystal itself was aware of their presence. But how does it work? Luca asked. How do we access it? Zara's expression softened, a fleeting look of sadness passing over her face. It was never meant to be used by just one person. It was meant to be shared, to be a collective effort, but with my people gone, I do not know if it will work for us. I was never trained to use it, not alone, only in the company of others. Luca furrowed his brow. You mean we have to activate it together? Zara nodded slowly. Perhaps, but we must be careful. The energy stored within this place is powerful, dangerous. It could help us, or it could destroy us. Luca took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The stakes were high, but there was no turning back now. They had come this far, and there was no other choice. They had to try. Without another word, Zara reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the crystal. A pulse of light surged through the chamber, bright and blinding, and for a moment, Luca thought he might be struck down by the sheer intensity of it. But then the light faded, leaving behind a faint glow that illuminated the room. Zara stepped back, her face pale. It is beginning, we have to hurry. Luca nodded and moved to her side, placing his hands on the crystal as well. As soon as his fingers made contact, the humming sound intensified, vibrating through his entire body. He could feel the power coursing through the crystal, surging through him in waves. His mind felt stretched, as though it were being pulled apart and put back together in a way that made no sense. Images flashed before his eyes, memories, fragments of a life that was not his own. He saw glimpses of a civilization that had once flourished on this planet, advanced beyond imagination. He saw the rise of Zara's people, their achievements, their triumphs. And then, just as quickly, he saw their fall, war, disease, destruction. The images blurred and twisted, and for a moment, Luca lost track of what was real and what was not. Through it all, Zara's voice echoed in his mind, "Focus, stay with me." And then the memories began to fade, replaced by something else, something new. Luca gasped as he was filled with knowledge, vast, overwhelming knowledge. He could feel the history of Zara's people flooding his mind, like a torrent of data rushing into him. It was as though he could suddenly understand the technology, the science, the language, everything they had left behind. He could see the answers to questions he didn't even know he had. He could feel Zara's pain, her loss, but also her strength, her resolve. For a brief moment, he understood her completely. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the flood of knowledge stopped. The crystal hummed once more, and the light dimmed to a soft glow. Zara staggered back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but Luca held his ground, his body trembling as the last remnants of the experience faded from his mind. What was that?" Luca asked, his voice hoarse. Zara didn't answer immediately. She was still reeling from the experience, her eyes unfocused as she struggled to make sense of what had just happened. "It was everything," she whispered. "All the knowledge of my people, the power to change everything, to rebuild. But it comes at a cost. We have seen what we wanted to see. Now we must decide what to do with it." Luca's mind was spinning, the weight of what they had uncovered heavy on his shoulders. They had found the key, but now they had to make a choice, one that could change the course of their future. Could they use the power of the crystal to rebuild, to save what was left of Zara's people, or would they risk everything, venturing into the unknown? "We don't have much time," Zara said, her voice low and urgent. "The storm is coming." Luca nodded. The storm outside would only make it harder to leave, to find their way out of this forgotten place. But there was no choice now. They had to leave, and they had to decide what their future would be. Together, they stepped away from the crystal, the weight of their decisions pressing down on them as they turned toward the exit, ready to face whatever the universe had in store for them next. The path forward. The storm was closing in. Luca could feel the tremors of the planet's winds through the very stones of the mountain, as if the earth itself was growing restless, awakening to a new possibility. The hum of the crystal still echoed faintly in his mind, a reminder of the power that lay dormant inside him and Zara. Yet, despite the knowledge and potential they had just unlocked, Luca couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the moment of triumph he had expected. Instead, it felt like a quiet pause before the real storm, figurative and literal, struck. Zara led the way, her movements calm, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in her steps. She seemed lost in thought, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on her shoulders. Luca followed closely behind, his own thoughts swirling as he tried to make sense of the knowledge they had uncovered. The crystal had revealed the truth about Zara's people, their fall, and their hopes for the future. But it hadn't given them clear answers. They had the power to rebuild. They could harness the ancient technology to resurrect what was lost, but that power came at a cost. The energy within the crystal, if misused, could destroy what remained of the planet. It was a delicate balance, and neither of them was sure if they could wield it responsibly. As they reached the narrow passageway that led back to the surface, Luca spoke up, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Zara," he said softly, "what are we going to do now?" She didn't turn to look at him, but her voice answered with quiet resolve. "We leave. We find a way to use what we've learned and move forward. There's nothing left here for me, for my people. The planet is dead, Luca. We can't stay." Luca's heart clenched. "But we can rebuild. We can make something of this. It's not just about your people. There's knowledge here, technology. It could help." "No," Zara interrupted, her voice sharper than Luca had ever heard it. She finally turned to face him, her eyes glimmering with an intensity that almost made him step back. "You don't understand. I've seen it. I've seen the destruction it caused before. I can't let it happen again. My people. They used that power recklessly. They thought they could control everything. And now I'm the last one left. I can't allow the same mistake to be made." Luca felt a pang of regret. He had been so consumed by the idea of rebuilding, of finding a way to restore what had been lost. But Zara was right. She had seen the devastation firsthand. She knew better than anyone the cost of using such power. They emerged into the storm, the winds howling violently as they stepped into the open air. The landscape had changed even further. What had been dry and dusty before was now battered by fierce gusts, the ground shifting beneath their feet. The sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds, as though the very heavens were protesting their presence. Luca glanced at Zara. Despite the storm, her face was set with a determination that left no room for doubt. She had made her decision. "Where do we go now?" Luca asked, his voice barely audible over the winds. Zara's eyes softened, and she took a deep breath as though steeling herself for the next part of the journey. "There's a ship, a small vessel my people used to travel between the moons of this system. It's hidden in the caves nearby. We'll take it and we'll leave this planet behind, for good." Luca nodded, not entirely sure what to expect. But the urgency in Zara's voice was enough to make him trust her, to follow her wherever she led. They trudged through the storm, their path lit only by the faint glow of distant lightning. The journey was treacherous, the wind making it difficult to see and even harder to hear. Every step felt like it could be their last, the planet pushing back against them, refusing to let them escape its clutches. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached a cliffside. Zara stopped, her eyes scanning the rocks. Then, with a fluid movement, she pressed her palm against the stone, and a hidden door slid open before them. Inside, the air was still and cool, a sharp contrast to the chaos outside. The cave was small, but it held something far more significant, a sleek metallic ship, its design unlike anything Luca had ever seen. It was small, compact, and yet exuded an aura of power and precision, as if it had been built for a purpose far beyond anything Luca could imagine. Zara moved toward the ship, her fingers brushing over the smooth surface of the hull. "This was meant for escape," she said quietly. "In case of emergency, my people had a plan, but I'm the last one left, and there is no one else to take this journey." Luca stood back for a moment, taking in the sight of the ship. The gravity of it all hit him, the enormity of their decision, the weight of what they were about to leave behind. He had spent years exploring the depths of space, finding new planets, new life, new possibilities. But this felt different. This was not about discovery. This was about survival. "I'm not sure what's waiting for us out there," Luca said, his voice low. "But wherever we go, we can't stay here. I understand that now." Zara turned to him, her expression softening. "You don't have to understand everything, Luca. We just have to move forward together." Luca gave a slow nod, his heart heavy but his resolve growing stronger. He wasn't sure what would happen when they left this world behind, but he knew that with Zara there was a chance for something new. A future. a purpose. As Zara boarded the ship, Luca followed, his mind racing with the questions that remained unanswered. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the ship's engines slowly filling the space. Zara's hands flew over the controls with practiced ease, and before long the ship lifted off the ground, rising into the sky. Through the viewport, Luca watched as the storm raged on below, the planet that had once been home to Zara's people growing smaller and smaller. And as they ascended into the darkness of space, he felt a flicker of hope. This was not the end. It was the beginning. A new path not just for Zara, but for him as well. They were bound together by a shared purpose now, a shared future that they would forge together, no matter where the journey led them. The stars stretched out before them, infinite and waiting. And in that vast expanse, anything was possible.